Good. Glad to see everybody's got their coffee or their tea or whatever their morning routine is. My name is Cedric Lundy, and I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Watershed. And this morning, as hinted by David Roberts last week, I will be taking a closer look at some passages that the devil or Satan plays a key role in. Today, we will be looking at Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. I was looking for a slide, a picture. Yeah. Thank you to a certain someone in the crowd when I posted on Facebook this week that I would be speaking about this. They messaged me this meme, to which I said, "Oh, you better believe that's going up." Which my first question about or my first thought about that picture is like Satan looked like he about to invent twerking. Which gives a totally different spin on Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, and also led to me randomly pulling up a song I hadn't listened to in a long time, Drop It Like It's Hot. And I'll stop there because every other joke that I have borders on slightly inappropriate. But that being said, one of the texts, because there's three accounts of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, one in Matthew, one in Mark, one in Luke, and Matthew and Luke's account goes into great detail. Mark's account just says, like it happened, and it moves on. But we'll be looking specifically, or I'll be reading specifically from the account in Matthew. And it says, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry," which, just for context's sake, in the other account, it makes it almost sound like this happened during the 40 days and 40 nights, whereas this one kind of make it sound like it wasn't until after the 40 days and 40 nights, but I digress. And the tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Like, bro, you hungry, and you're divine. Like, dude, just, touch it and make it into bread, or command it and make it into bread. No big deal, right? And Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. All that being said, right, with this account, with just the devil coming and, tempting Jesus, and basically just showing up in the scene in a very strange and particular way that leads to all kinds of questions, right? I want to acknowledge that we have people in the room who grew up in the church. And so your maybe perception and understanding of what you learned about the devil, what he does, how he operates, what he looks like, has maybe been shaped by being in those circles, raised in that tradition. On the flip side, I would be amiss if I didn't acknowledge that we have plenty of people in the room, tuning in online or listening to this later, that didn't grow up in the church and perhaps have found this story confusing or just plain weird. That maybe the devil is also, and the reality of the devil is highly questionable, to say the least. And I would presume that these two crowds, the church crowd and the unchurched crowd, the intersection of our understanding of the devil would be in the arts and popular culture. To which I have a list of my most memorable, I don't want to say top, my most memorable depictions of the devil or Satan in the movies, in film. These are not in any particular order, but the first one on my list is, and this list dates me, I'm just letting you know, because there's been plenty of movies dating back to his earliest cinema. Jack Nicholson playing Daryl Van Horn in The Witches of Eastwick. The premise is three women played by Cher, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Susan Sarandon, who are unaware of the power they possess, unknowingly summon what they consider to be the perfect man. He seduces all three of them and their lives dramatically improve, but when they attempt to distance themselves, they see their worst fears materialize. The film does not directly refer to Daryl Van Horn as the devil, but especially at the end, it is strongly inferred. The second on my list is Tim Curry playing Darkness in the 1985 movie directed by all people, Ridley Scott. This is just a weird one to end up in, like the movieography, the filmography of the man that gave us Blade Runner and Alien and Gladiator. Just this one just seems like totally out of left field. But in this movie, Satan is represented by the Lord of Darkness, who threatens to destroy all mankind and enter the earth into an eternal ice age. And the Lord of Darkness also steals the hero's girl, Lily, and tries to marry her, which who can blame him because she's also Sloane from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And I think that one is like the first movie we get Tom Cruise where he got his teeth fixed. But again, I digress. Last but certainly not least is Al Pacino playing John Milton, which is ironically, I didn't even know this until I looked it up recently. And I worked at the movie theater when this movie was out. So I saw this movie lots of different times. But playing John Milton, which is a reference to, anybody know it? Anybody know it? That's right, Paradise Lost. Who is ultimately revealed to be Satan in human form, manipulates his son, a criminal attorney, who is ignorant of his true parentage, just like he is ignorant that he's the one. Thank you. To accept his demonic heritage in the end when Milton loses by deception, you can see his falling hinting at the ancient legend. This means that Lucifer was an angel until he was expelled to hell. In all the various movie depictions, the devil or Satan follow along a few tropes. They generally fall into a few categories. There's Satan the negotiator, where the devil basically bargains with someone in order to get their soul. I give you what you want, your deepest desire in life. In exchange, I get your soul for all of eternity. The second one is one I like to call Satan that desperately wants to be your daddy, your baby daddy, who just so happens to be the Antichrist. The baby ends up being the Antichrist. Last but not least, there's Satan, I just want the whole world to burn, but first I have to pull off an elaborate nonsensical scheme that involves killing the world's last two unicorns. All that being said, that in pop culture, the devil is little more than God's adversary and a trickster. So I suppose this biblical story of Jesus being tempted by the devil fits that mold in some senses. He's there trying to trick Jesus. He's trying to get Jesus to do things that he wouldn't otherwise do. He even does the whole, hey, I'll give you like all the kingdoms of the world if you just worship me. Notice he doesn't even like, I want your soul. He's just like, yeah, just bow down and worship me, right? He is there, and we see him in this story trying to oppose or derail the Lord's anointed, the Messiah. We see him trying to deceive and trick and negotiate Jesus. Conversely, if you grew up in the church, you've probably heard it said that the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness demonstrates that more often than not, the devil will attempt to sway you from the path by appealing to your pride, your desire for power, or popularity. Secondly, you likely heard something along the lines of the story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by the devil and successfully resisting the devil demonstrates that we have to be strong in the Word, the Bible, in order to resist sin and evil. Third, if you grew up in the church, you likely heard something along the lines of this story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness demonstrates that we too should engage in the spiritual discipline of fasting so that we can also build up our dependence on God. There's been all kinds of different ways, or I shouldn't even say all kinds of different ways, that we've maybe been led to view or look at this story, because in a lot of ways they're very narrow, which is the reason why we're in this series, Textuality, in the first place. So this morning, I want to kind of just widen the lens to be able to maybe see this particular story through a completely different lens and what that might say to us so that we actually get something out of it that actually, I don't know, maybe inspires us to live lives that aren't, as David kind of alluded to, dominated by maybe this fear or just this complete dismissiveness as this being some sort of useless story or narrative in the scripture. Because of the way it's been taught in a lot of ways, very narrow kind of ways, historically there have been two prevailing questions around this narrative. One, did it actually happen? And when I say did it actually happen, what I mean by that was this something that happened in a way that if you just happen to be around in first century Israel, when Jesus is out in the wilderness and for some odd, strange reason, you just happen to be wandering through the exact same desert at the exact same time, would you off in the distance see this one dude who just looked woe out, right? Because he hadn't eaten and he's barely drank anything for 40 days. So, right, he'd be tired. He would look all kinds of disheveled, right? And then he's probably wearing a white robe, right? Because that's how a lot of the classical art depicts him. And then just following ever so, like, creepily behind in his ear, or just, taunting him is some figure dressed in black. And of course, it's a cloak, so you can only see his eyes, right? Like you would actually be saying, what is going on out there? And should I go help, right? Was it something that actually happened like that? Or was it some sort of internal struggle that Jesus was having, right? Because he's in the wilderness. 40 days, 40 nights, very little to eat. And who knows, maybe he was hallucinating. That was for those of you who also grew up in the church, right? So, how real is this story? That would be one question. The second question would be, wait a minute. I've read in James where it says that God cannot be tempted. So did this really actually happen? And if it did happen, then it basically contradicts where James said that God cannot be tempted. And if Jesus is fully man and fully God, then was he really, really tempted? I mean, was he really, really struggling internally with whether or not to do these things? Can I suggest that both these questions are largely irrelevant? Not because they aren't good questions to ask. And I say that as someone who every time someone says, in particular to little kids and teenagers, hey, there's no bad questions. Under my breath, I'm like, oh yeah, there is. That being said, to be fair, what I mean by a bad question is sometimes people don't put a lot of thought into their questions, or they haven't maybe done some self-introspection before they ask the question, or there's some questions that are just naive. I just use bad for shorthand. But I digress. Maybe what really is the reason why these questions aren't great questions, or they're questions that are largely irrelevant, is because they are questions that are developed out of primarily engaging with the Bible in order to defend it. That these questions derive out of centuries of Christians trying to prove that the Bible is, quote, true, and largely through modern eyes. It falls into the category of apologetics and reveals that so much of the way many of us have been raised is our primary engagement with the divine is actually through this book and not actually engaging the mystery of the divine. So why would the gospel writers include this story in their accounts? Why would it make the cut? It isn't an accident that this story is here. It isn't an accident that this story takes place or is positioned immediately after Jesus is baptized. In the accounts of Jesus being baptized, it is said that the Spirit of God descended on Jesus like a dove, and that a voice from the heavens could be heard saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." That before Jesus goes into the wilderness, we get this story of Jesus being divinely affirmed. To put it another way, if Jesus is fully God and fully man, he might right now be feeling really full of himself on the God side. So it is not a mistake that the gospel writers would put, not only for, let's say, chronologically, this is the order that it happened, but if Jesus is moving through his life in intentionality, then it also isn't a mistake that Jesus, right after that moment, would then go into the wilderness, because Israel has been looking for a Messiah for centuries. And you just had this apparently divine moment that other people would have been able to witness, where they would then respond in a certain kind of way as to elevate him. And instead, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, again, if it's about, quote, defending the Bible, then maybe we lead to some of those questions. Maybe we assert or assume certain things instead of perhaps maybe seeing, right? Because, again, we're often oriented around either defending the Bible or ultimately it all about being about Jesus is the way to heaven. And showing that Jesus is, in fact, perfect. He is without sin. So he goes into the wilderness, he's tempted, he doesn't sin, he passes the test, and he can go on with his earthly ministry. But, as has been suggested from this stage by myself and others multiple times, perhaps Jesus isn't all about the way to heaven. Perhaps Jesus is about the way to be human. And so after this divine affirmation moment, Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days, 40 nights, which is also not ironic, because also in Israel's history, you had Israel wandering through the wilderness, not for 40 days or 40 nights, but for 40 years, right? That Jesus doesn't eat, and he experiences his humanity. He experiences his frailty. He experiences that he is not, quote, invincible by putting on human flesh. That Jesus begins this journey of pointing us back towards our humanity, which again is not an accident. Because if we go back to the first story where it is at least inferred that we have an interaction with the devil, which, side note, it says serpent, doesn't say the devil, and this is going to open up a can of worms, but you can look into it a little bit more later because I also have to do the research on it. But did you know that the serpent in ancient pagan religious practices was actually a symbol of feminine power and fertility? And who do we often blame for sin? That being said, that when they are tempted by the serpent in essence tempts them or deceives them into thinking that the very first thing that God said about them is not fully true. The first thing God says about humanity is that they are, say it loud and proud, good. That's right, he says they're good. We're all kind of traumatized from classroom situations where we're called on. It's like, am I going to say the right answer? I know what it is, but I just don't want to be wrong. Yes, it says that we're good. What does Satan say? But you could be more. I mean, if you eat the fruit, then you'll know the difference between good and evil. David broke that all down for us. You should go back and listen again and again and again. But in essence, what he tempted them to believe is that they were not good enough. They were not good enough. That how they were made, who they are, the essence of them was not good enough. And so in eating the fruit from the tree or whatever it was, that this is symbolic of them in essence rejecting their humanity. And what does the devil come and tempt Jesus to do? Well, let's take a look. First, he starts with, turn this stone into bread. Which, let's be honest, would Jesus turning the stone into bread be him actually sinning? I mean, right after this, he goes to a wedding in Cana and he says, oh, y'all out of wine? Keep the party going. Right? We also see two different instances where people are hungry and they ain't got anything but a couple of scraps of bread and some fish. And he says, everybody eats. Right? So, like, what would be the sin in that? He's hungry. He's fully God and fully man. Why not? Right? We also see, he says, throw yourself down. The angels will come and get you. I mean, it'd be fun. It'd be like inventing bungee jumping without the cord. All right? Would he be sinning just by jumping off and letting the angels catch him? I would argue no. Some may argue yes, but for the sake of where I'm going, right? He doesn't do it. Those first two in particular, what we see is that the devil, in a way, is seeing if Jesus, for a moment, will not live into being fully human. That we have limitations. That it's not meant to be the fact, but it is part of the human experience that suffering is real. Being hungry is real. Tiredness and exhaustion is real. And just for a moment, he can just tap into his divine privilege and forgo that inconvenience, that discomfort. And Jesus instead chooses to continue to live into his humanity and have solidarity with us. That instead of jumping off and letting the angels come rescue him, he lives into the fact that while the human body is great and awesome and all those things, it's good, like it's also going to break if you throw it off a high cliff. All right? Last but not least comes the one where he says, yo, you see all these kingdoms? I'll give it all to you if you just worship me. And of course, Jesus does not take him up on this offer. But what is it about this offer that makes this one in particular unique out of the three? Could it be that by offering Jesus, quote, these kingdoms, by only bowing down and worshiping him, that Jesus will bypass his inevitable death and suffering? Not his inevitable death and suffering in order to, quote, overcome sin, but it is the last and final piece of him living out that solidarity with humanity. That the miracle of the Holy Week is that if even for a moment a God would voluntarily die that would go through all that suffering, that he would basically forgo having to go through even that experience of death in order to, quote, have the kingdoms of the world. Jesus chooses at every time to live fully into his humanity and thus identify with our humanity. And yet again, once again, in other words, after God and Jesus being affirmed divinely in the baptism, Jesus goes into the wilderness to affirm his humanity. And so, my orientation to this and so many other stories in the Bible, as I've hinted, for a long time centered around resolving the issue of sin. My own humanity, which is so often in the Christian tradition associated with this idea of, quote, depravity. But ever since reorienting it around the idea that we are inherently good and that it's through being deceived into believing that I am not good enough, that I become more susceptible to, quote, sinning against my neighbor, sinning against God's good world, and sinning against myself. I've been able to reimagine or see with fresh eyes things that I've been doing or practicing for a long time and give them new meaning through this lens of Jesus reconnecting us with our humanity and having this solidarity with us. That in essence, Jesus, quote, rescues us through the shared human experience. That so often, and for me growing up, church experience focused on the divine aspect of God and of Christ, that oftentimes I miss the things that were also meant to take me back to the humanity of Jesus. And one of those practices in particular that we will have an opportunity to engage in today is communion. That so often when it came time for communion to partake in the Lord's Supper, that it was centered around this practice of me acknowledging that I'm, quote, a sinner, that I have transgressed against God, and that only through this, quote, divine punishment that Jesus basically substitutes or stands in my place. Maybe many of you were also raised with that same kind of tradition. Heck, there were even debates very early on in church history whether or not, or if you were raised Lutheran, that the elements actually literally became the blood and body of Jesus. But it was all centered around this idea of resolving sin. But perhaps, and today could be a chance to practice that if you are so inclined. Communion can be an opportunity for us to remember as we hold these ordinary elements, bread and grape juice, that Jesus stepped into, the divine poured itself into a very real flesh and blood human body, and experienced from birth to death the human experience, your experience. And that the divine saw fit in some mysterious way that we are still trying to wrap our heads around today, that ultimately it was an affirmation that humanity is still good, that the very first thing that God said about humanity is still true, despite the devil's schemes to deceive us into believing otherwise. That if it's good enough for Jesus to walk around in and experience the breadth of the human experience. Because we oftentimes forget, like 33 is old, right, in ancient Israel. First century ancient Israel. So, in a moment, I'm going to, quote, read from the 1 Corinthians chapter 11 passage, which traditionally has been used as the invitation into communion. Here inside the room, there's a basket to the right here and to the left over here. For those of you outside, it is on a table sitting in front of the TV screen, I believe. And after I've read that passage, you are free, if you are so inclined, to come up and partake. And then we will continue with our closing out of this morning. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." And may I also add that whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you not only proclaim the Lord's death, you proclaim the Lord's humanity. You proclaim that we are saved not through the rejection of our humanity, but via the divine choice to find solidarity in the very things we are often find shameful and not good enough. That we proclaim that God has never wavered from his declaration that you are good.